Tiu De Chin, my entitled family wants to take my house and give it to my brother, even after leaving me to rot. Dike, Jia Din Dac Guen Qua Toi Muan Le Na Qua Toi Va Dua Cho Em Tre Toi, Na Icie Sao Kai Ho De Toi Loi Rua. Thumbnail text, my entitled family wants to take my house and give it to my brother, even after leaving me to rot in a freezing camper because winners never subsidize losers in this house. Dike, Jia Din Dac Guen Qua Toi Muan Le Na Qua Toi Va Dua Cho Em Tre Toi, Na Icie Sao Kai De Toi Chet Sang Trong Chik, Se Kim Tre Vi En Hung Nuoi Chien Tang Kong Bao Gio Tro Kap Cho Ku Thua Kuok Trong Ken Na Nai. My entitled family wants to take my house and give it to my brother, even after leaving me to rot in a freezing camper because winners never subsidize losers in this house. I am 32 years old now, but some wounds do not care about time. They do not fade. They just sit quietly under the surface, waiting for the right moment to ache. If you want to understand why I eventually burned the bridges to my family and salted the earth behind them, you have to understand the soil we grew up in. Our house was not a home, it was a psychological arena, and the rules were rigged long before I even understood I was playing a game. My father, Victor, and my mother, Brenda, had a very specific vision of what a family should look like. And in that vision, my younger brother Dalton was the sun, and the rest of us were just dust caught in his gravity. Dalton is 29 now, 3 years my junior, but growing up, he was treated like royalty trapped in a suburban disguise. The favoritism was not just about getting the better Christmas presents or the larger slice of cake. It was a systematic, terrifying form of emotional manipulation. They programmed him to believe his mere existence was a gift to the world, and they programmed me to be the shock absorber for all his failures. There is one memory that perfectly captures the twisted dynamic of my childhood. When I was 19, I spent a whole summer working backbreaking shifts at a local diner to buy my first car. It was a rusted piece of junk, but it was mine. A week after I got the keys, Dalton, who was 16 and did not even have a license, took it for a joyride while I was asleep. He crashed it straight into our neighbor's brick mailbox. The front end was completely smashed. I remember standing on the lawn, staring at the wreckage of my entire summer's labor, tears of pure rage hot on my face. But when Victor walked out, he did not yell at Dalton. He did not ground him. He looked at me, sighed heavily as if my grief was an inconvenience, and told me I should not have left the keys on the kitchen counter. He forced me to pay for the neighbor's mailbox out of my remaining savings. When I finally found the courage to scream that it was not fair, Victor gave me a look so cold it froze my blood. He pointed a finger at my chest and delivered the motto that would define our family forever. He said, "Winners never subsidize losers in this house. Dalton has a bright future, and your whining is bringing his energy down. Figure it out yourself." That was the core wound. I was the loser. Dalton was the winner. From that day on, I stopped asking them for anything. I became a ghost in my own house, watching from the dark hallway as my parents poured every ounce of their affection, money, and time into Dalton's golden aura. I learned to survive on the scraps of their attention, building an emotional armor so thick I forgot what it felt like to be genuinely cared for. I thought that keeping my head down and asking for nothing would protect me. I was completely wrong. It only taught them that my boundaries did not exist, and my resources were theirs for the taking. You would think that parents who invest everything into one child would eventually expect a return on that investment. But Victor and Brenda were operating under the sunk cost fallacy. They had spent decades building Dalton up into this grand monument of success, so when he turned out to be an incredibly average, deeply entitled adult with zero financial sense, they simply refused to accept reality. Instead, they doubled down. And their delusion was weaponized the day Dalton brought Cassidy into our lives. Cassidy is my sister-in-law, and if manipulation was an Olympic sport, she would have gold medals lining her walls. On the surface, she was very pretty. She had this bright, innocent smile and a college degree that she loved to mention in casual conversation. But underneath that veneer was a parasite perfectly evolved to drain my parents dry. Cassidy firmly believed that her beauty and her mere presence elevated our family's social standing. Therefore, she reasoned, she was entirely exempt from the concept of manual labor or financial contribution. She never applied for a job. Instead, she weaponized incompetence and victimhood with absolute mastery. If anyone ever questioned her lack of employment, she would unleash a torrent of tears so convincing you would think you had just kicked a puppy. She would sob about how the modern workplace was too stressful for her sensitive nature, or how nobody understood her anxiety. Dalton, trained to be the center of the universe, found a perfect match in Cassidy. They fed off each other's narcissism. To secure her permanent place on the throne of my parents' house, Cassidy deployed the oldest trick in the book. She started having kids, one after another, for children in the span of 7 years. With every new pregnancy, the walls of my parents' cramped, 3-bedroom house built in the 60s seemed to close in further. It was a suffocating environment. But the most tragic part was watching my mother, Brenda, willingly walk into the trap. Brenda became a free, full-time nanny. Cassidy would sleep in until noon, spend Dalton's mediocre salary on online shopping, and complain about being exhausted, while Brenda chased toddlers around the living room, looking older and more hollowed out by the day. It was a total emotional bankruptcy. Victor and Brenda were drained, their retirement savings bleeding dry to feed Dalton and Cassidy's expanding family, but they could not stop. To stop would mean admitting that their golden boy was a failure and that the daughter-in-law they bragged about was a leech. So, they swallowed their misery and redirected their resentment toward the only safe target available, me. Every time I visited for a mandatory holiday dinner, they would look at my quiet, independent life, and I could see the bitter jealousy in their eyes. They hated that I had escaped the madhouse they created. Then came the year 2020, and the world shut down. I had built a decent life for myself. I was living in a nice rented condo with a roommate, working a solid logistics job that paid the bills. But the pandemic hit my industry like a freight train. My company downsized practically overnight, and I was handed a cardboard box and a severance check that barely covered a month of groceries. 2 weeks later, my roommate lost his job too. We could not afford the rent on unemployment money, so we broke the lease. I sold almost everything I owned just to avoid taking on debt. I was terrified. I was 30 years old, staring down the barrel of homelessness. I had an old, reliable pickup truck from the 90s, and with my very last $1,000, I bought a beat-up, used camper shell to mount on the back. It was supposed to be a temporary lifeboat. I just needed a place to park it for a few months while I aggressively hunted for a new job. Swallowing every ounce of my pride, I drove that clunky truck back to my hometown. I pulled up to Victor and Brenda's house. I didn't ask to sleep inside. I didn't ask for food. I just asked if I could park the camper in the corner of their long driveway. Just a patch of concrete to rest on without fear of being towed. I stood on the front porch, the cold wind biting through my jacket, explaining my situation. Victor stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. Behind him, I could see Dalton and Cassidy sitting on the couch. Cassidy leaned over, looking past Victor's shoulder, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on her lips. "We have a full house," Victor said flatly, his arms crossed over his chest. "I won't come inside," I pleaded, feeling my throat tighten. "I just need the driveway. I'll stay in the camper. It's just until the job market opens back up." Victor shook his head. "If you want to park that eyesore on my property, you pay rent. Market rate for a 1-bedroom apartment. Take it or leave it." I stared at him in disbelief. "Dad, I'm on unemployment. If I could afford apartment rent, I wouldn't be living in the bed of a truck." That was when Cassidy laughed. A sharp, loud, piercing sound that cut through the chilly air. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me. "Look at the homeless bum," she giggled to Dalton. "I guess that independent lifestyle didn't work out so well." Dalton joined in, chuckling and shaking his head in disgust. I looked at Victor, begging him silently with my eyes to defend me, to show just 1 ounce of fatherly mercy. Instead, his face hardened into that same cold mask from my teenage years. "A driveway is too good for a failure like you," Victor said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You made your bed. Now sleep in it." Remember the rule. Winners never subsidize losers in this house. He slammed the door in my face. The deadbolt clicked. I stood there on the porch for a long time, the reality settling into my bones like ice. They were not just rejecting a favor, they were enjoying my destruction. I walked back to my truck, climbed into the freezing camper, and drove away. There is a specific kind of cold that you only experience when you are sleeping in a metal box parked on asphalt. It does not just chill your skin, it gets into your joints and makes your bones ache. My camper had no central heating, just a cheap, 0-degree sleeping bag and a tiny electric space heater that I could rarely use. During those first few months of winter, I would wake up at 3 in the morning to find my own breath condensed and frozen into little icicles on the ceiling of the camper shell. Occasionally, a drop of freezing water would fall directly onto my face, jolting me awake in the pitch black. Living as an asphalt nomad is an exercise in constant, low-grade terror. Every time a car drove past the dark parking lot where I was hiding, my heart would hammer against my ribs. You become invisible to normal society, but highly visible to the desperate. I had to learn the unspoken rules of the streets. I learned which big-box store parking lots were safe for a few hours, and which ones would get a flashlight shined in your eyes by an angry security guard threatening to tow your only shelter. Power was my biggest anxiety. The camper had a small battery system that ran a mini-fridge so my cheap groceries wouldn't spoil. To keep it charged, I had to be a ghost. I bought a heavy-duty, 100-foot extension cord. In the dead of night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I would park down the street from a random commercial building, creep through the bushes like a thief, and plug my cord into an outdoor outlet. I would sit in the freezing truck cab, staring at the shadows, terrified that police sirens were about to ruin my life over 50 cents worth of stolen electricity. The humiliation was a heavy cloak I wore every day. But the moment that truly crystallized my hatred for my family happened a few months into my homelessness. I was parked at the far end of a massive grocery store lot, sitting on the tailgate of the truck, eating a cold can of baked beans. I looked up and saw a familiar silver minivan cruising down the aisle. It was Dalton and Cassidy. They had just finished shopping. Dalton spotted my truck. He slowed the minivan down to a crawl. Cassidy rolled down the passenger window. She didn't say a word. She just stared at me with this look of absolute, aristocratic disgust, like she was looking at roadkill. Dalton leaned over her, holding a half-empty, extra-large fast food soda cup. With a mocking grin, he tossed the cup out the window. It hit the windshield of my truck, bursting open and splattering sticky, brown liquid all over the glass and the hood. They sped off, the sound of their laughter echoing across the empty pavement. I didn't yell. I didn't chase them. I quietly put down my beans, grabbed a rag, and wiped the freezing, sticky mess off my windshield. With every wipe, something inside me shifted. The sadness was gone. The desire for my parents' approval evaporated. What replaced it was a cold, pure, and incredibly focused anger. I realized right then that my family had left me to die. And I decided, in that freezing parking lot, that I was going to survive just to spite them. Survival requires a bunker, and I found mine behind a massive logistics warehouse in a neighboring city, about 45 minutes away from my hometown. I finally landed a job as a floor worker. It was brutal, backbreaking labor, unloading heavy freight from trucks for 10 hours a day, but to me, it felt like salvation. The owner of the company was a tough, no-nonsense guy who appreciated desperation if it translated into hard work. After a few weeks of proving I could outwork anyone on the floor, I approached him. I explained my living situation and asked if I could park the camper in the abandoned, overgrown section of the back lot, near the shipping containers. He looked at my calloused hands, nodded, and said as long as I didn't cause trouble, he didn't care. That back lot became my sanctuary. For the next year and a half, I turned myself into a machine. Because my commute was literally a 50-yard walk from my truck to the warehouse doors, I took every single shift they offered. Day shifts, night shifts, weekend overtime. If someone called in sick, I was there. My routine was monk-like. I would wake up at dawn, work until my muscles screamed, take a freezing shower at a cheap $20 a month local gym, eat whatever canned soup was on sale, and pass out in the camper. My boss let me run a hose from the building for water, and I paid him a tiny fraction of my wages to plug legally into the warehouse power grid. I befriended the night security guards, trading cups of cheap instant coffee for small talk. They became more of a family to me in those cold months than my actual blood relatives ever were. The psychological shift was profound. Stripped of all family expectations, I was unchained. I didn't have to listen to Victor's lectures about winners and losers. I didn't have to watch Brenda drain her soul for Cassidy's kids. I was entirely alone, and the silence was glorious. I funneled 90% of my paycheck straight into a high-yield savings account. I watched the numbers grow. $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. Every dollar was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and my past. My relentless work ethic didn't go unnoticed. Management saw that I understood the logistics systems better than the supervisors who were just there to collect a check. By the end of my second year in the camper, I was pulled off the floor and promoted to a supervisory management position. Suddenly, I wasn't making hourly wages anymore. I had a salary. A good one. I had health insurance. I had clawed my way out of the gutter with my bare hands, and I had done it completely alone. The trauma of homelessness never really leaves you. It makes you crave stability the way a drowning man craves air. With my new salary and a massive pile of savings, I started aggressively hunting for real estate. I wanted something permanent. 2 miles from the warehouse, I found it, a 3-bedroom manufactured home sitting on a decent-sized plot of land. It wasn't a mansion, but it was structurally sound, had a beautiful living room with large windows, and best of all, the seller was desperate to offload it. I negotiated fiercely and got it for $10,000 under the asking price. I dumped almost my entire savings into the down payment and secured the mortgage. The day I got the keys, I drove my truck onto the property, backed it right up into the spacious backyard, and finally, after 2 agonizing years, I unbolted the camper shell from the truck bed. I set the camper down on cinder blocks in the grass. It looked like a tiny, weird guest house, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It had kept me alive. Walking into that house for the first time, breathing in the smell of fresh paint and clean carpets, I broke down. I slept in the master bedroom on an air mattress that first week, and it felt like sleeping on a cloud. I had won. I had beaten the system. But pride is a dangerous thing. A few weeks after I settled in and bought a decent couch, I made a fatal mistake. Sitting in my warm, bright living room, feeling a surge of triumph, I took a picture of the sunlight hitting the floorboards and posted it to my Facebook page. I wrote a simple caption about finally having a place to call my own. I had been low contact with my family, assuming they didn't care enough to check on me. But I underestimated the predatory nature of a parasite. Cassidy, sitting in the cramped squalor of my parents' house, saw the post. I found out much later how she tracked me down. She didn't have my address, but she zoomed in on the window in the background of my photo. She recognized the specific brand sign of a local gas station across the street. Using that clue, she cross-referenced the neighborhood on Google Maps, and then, using my legal name, she searched the county's public property tax records online. She found the deed. She found the exact address. She saw the square footage and the lot size. And in her twisted, entitled mind, my fortress suddenly became the solution to all her problems. The wolves had caught my scent, and they were already on their way. Thank you for following the story this far. If you relate to this program, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment and interaction helps the video reach a wider audience. Thank you so much, and let's continue the story. It was a quiet Sunday morning. I was sitting in my living room, drinking a hot cup of coffee, looking out the large front window, and just enjoying the absolute silence. For the first time in my life, I felt completely secure. My mortgage was paid, my bank accounts had a healthy buffer, and the ghosts of my past felt miles away. Then, the doorbell rang. It was not a polite ring. It was a frantic, demanding series of buzzes followed by heavy pounding on the solid wood door. I set my mug down, a cold knot instantly forming in my stomach. When I looked through the peephole, my heart dropped into my shoes. Standing on my front porch, bundled in winter coats and wearing identical expressions of aggressive curiosity, were Victor, Brenda, Dalton, and Cassidy. I had not given them my address. I had not invited them. But there they were, like a pack of wolves that had finally tracked down a bleeding deer. I unbolted the door and cracked it open, intending to ask them how they found me and tell them to leave. But before I could even get a word out, Victor shoved his shoulder against the door, pushing it wide open. They practically trampled over the threshold, brushing past me like I was a bellhop at a hotel. They did not take off their shoes. They did not say hello. They just started marching through my sanctuary, their eyes darting into every corner, assessing, measuring, and judging. Cassidy was the worst. She walked into the kitchen, running her hand along the granite countertops with a creepy, calculating smirk plastered across her face. She opened my pantry doors, peered into my living room, and tilted her head as she mentally calculated the square footage. Her eyes were gleaming with an ugly, ravenous hunger. Victor and Brenda followed close behind her, pointing at the high ceilings and the open floor plan. The passive-aggressive commentary started immediately. Brenda sighed loudly, shaking her head as she looked at the 3 doors leading down the hallway. She remarked, in a voice meant to carry, about how tragic it was that such a large, beautiful space was being wasted on a single man. She talked about how quiet and empty it felt, and how a house this size was practically begging for the joyful noise of children. Victor chimed in, loudly calculating the distance to Dalton's workplace, noting that my house was a good 20 minutes closer to Dalton's office than their current home. Every word they spoke was a calculated strike, designed to make me feel guilty for possessing something nice. They were laying the psychological groundwork to justify what they were about to do. They viewed my house not as an accomplishment I had bled for, but as an unfair hoarding of resources that rightfully belonged to the golden boy. I stood by the front door, my hands balled into tight fists, watching them invade the only safe space I had ever known. I could feel the old, familiar weight of my childhood trying to push me down, trying to make me shrink, but the 2 years I spent freezing in that camper had hardened my spine into steel. I was not the scapegoat anymore. Eventually, Dalton turned to me and snapped his fingers, gesturing toward the front porch. He told me we needed to speak privately. The moment we stepped outside, Victor, Brenda, and Cassidy conveniently retreated to the far end of the living room, leaving us alone. Dalton leaned against the porch railing, puffing out his chest to make himself look bigger. He did not ask me for a favor. He did not propose a business arrangement. He simply informed me of how things were going to be, speaking to me with the casual authority of a king addressing a peasant. He told me that my house was simply too much for me to handle alone. He explained that Cassidy was stressed, their 4 kids were cramped, and it was entirely unreasonable for me to live in comfort while his family suffered. Therefore, he had decided that his family would be moving into my house by the end of the month. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but he was completely serious. His narcissistic delusion was so deep, so thoroughly cultivated by 29 years of Victor and Brenda's enabling, that he genuinely believed the universe owed him my assets. He even had the audacity to lay out the ground rules for his occupation of my home. He pointed toward the backyard where my old camper sat on cinder blocks. He told me that since I was already used to living in the camper, I could just move back out there. He dictated that there would be strict curfews for me, so I would not disturb his children. He explicitly stated that I could not just walk into the main house any time I wanted without giving them prior notice. And the absolute peak of his insanity? He never once mentioned paying a single dime in rent. He fully expected me to continue paying the mortgage, the property taxes, and the insurance on a house I was legally barred from entering, just so he could play the role of a successful patriarch. I listened to him ramble on, watching his arms wave as he outlined the hostile takeover of my life. If it were a stranger, I would have thought they were having a psychotic break. But this was Dalton. This was the golden boy who had crashed my car and watched me pay for it. He finished his speech, flashed a patronizing smile, and actually reached his hand out to shake mine, as if we had just concluded a brilliant corporate merger. He truly thought I was just going to nod, hand over my keys, and walk out into the cold backyard like a good, obedient dog. As Dalton held his hand out, waiting for my submission, I slowly reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, opened the voice memo app, and hit record. I held it up right in front of his face. He blinked, confused, but his arrogance kept him from understanding the danger he was in. I did not yell at first. I spoke with a voice so low and dangerously calm that Dalton actually took a physical step backward. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that hell would freeze over before I let his toxic, leeching wife and his entitled attitude across my threshold again. I reminded him that I bought this house with the money I earned while he and his wife were mocking me for being homeless. I told him that his inability to afford a house was the direct result of his wife's refusal to work and his own sheer stupidity, and I was not going to be the financial shock absorber for his bad life choices. Then I threw the ultimate weapon right back in his face. I leaned in close and quoted Victor's sacred rule. I said, "Winners never subsidize losers. And right now, Dalton, you're looking like a massive loser." Dalton's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He started screaming, spitting venom about how selfish I was, how family comes first, and how I did not deserve any of this. Hearing the commotion, Victor, Brenda, and Cassidy rushed out onto the porch. They immediately surrounded me, a chorus of angry voices demanding compliance. Brenda started crying her fake, manipulative tears, begging me to just do it for Dalton. I raised my voice, roaring over all of them. I told them they had zero power over me. I looked at Cassidy and called her exactly what she was, a greedy, stuck-up parasite who used her kids as leverage to avoid working a single day in her life. That broke her. Cassidy let out a feral shriek and lunged at me. She swung her arm wildly, her long acrylic nails catching my cheek and tearing a deep, bloody scratch down the side of my face. She geared up to swing again, screaming that she was going to scratch my eyes out, but Dalton grabbed her from behind, wrestling her back as she kicked and thrashed like a wild animal. I wiped the blood off my cheek, held up my phone, and pointed to the recording timer ticking away on the screen. I screamed that they had exactly 10 seconds to get off my property before I called the police and had Cassidy arrested for assault. The threat of legal consequences finally pierced their delusion. Victor grabbed Brenda's arm, Dalton dragged a kicking Cassidy down the steps, and they piled into their minivan. Brenda rolled down the window and yelled that I had 1 week to come to my senses. I told her not to hold her breath. The moment their minivan disappeared around the corner, I went inside, locked the deadbolt, and walked straight to my computer. I knew exactly how my family operated. By the time they drove back to their house, they would have fabricated a completely twisted version of events where I was a violent, selfish monster who viciously attacked a poor, stressed mother of 4. They would use this narrative to rally the extended family, turning aunts, uncles, and cousins against me to apply unbearable social pressure. I refused to let them control the narrative. I took the audio recording from my phone, where Cassidy clearly threatened to scratch my eyes out after Dalton demanded my house for free, and I uploaded it directly to a private video link. Then I wrote out a massive, detailed post. I laid out everything. I talked about how they charged me apartment rent to park my camper in their driveway. I talked about Dalton throwing the soda at my windshield. And I detailed their attempt to forcefully evict me from my own property. I posted the text and the audio link to the massive extended family group chat on Facebook and tagged Victor, Brenda, Dalton, and Cassidy so everyone knew I was calling them out directly. It was a preemptive nuclear strike, and it worked flawlessly. Within an hour, my phone was blowing up with messages from horrified aunts and uncles. My parents had spent decades carefully curating a public image of being loving, selfless, Christian martyrs who just wanted the best for their boys. My post shattered that illusion into a million unfixable pieces. Because I struck first with undeniable audio evidence, my parents and Dalton did not even try to defend themselves online. The silence from their end was deafening. The only retaliation came a few days later from a distant cousin, one of Brenda's classic flying monkeys. He called me from an unknown number, screaming into the receiver that I was a horrible brother and that I needed to step aside and make way for a real family man who actually had children to shelter. I did not get angry. I calmly asked him if he was willing to sign the deed of his house over to Dalton for free. When he stammered and avoided the question, I called him a hypocrite, laughed, hung up, and blocked the number. Exactly 1 week later, just as Brenda had promised, my doorbell rang. I checked the camera. It was Victor and Brenda. They looked smaller, defeated, stripped of their usual arrogance. I did not open the door all the way. I left the heavy security chain locked and cracked it open just an inch. They immediately tried to push against the wood, but the chain held firm. Brenda put on her most sickly sweet voice, her eyes brimming with fresh crocodile tears, and asked if I was finally ready to let my beloved brother move in. I looked at her, entirely devoid of emotion, told them to go straight to hell, and slammed the door. I thought the public humiliation would be enough to keep them away. I underestimated the sheer, terrifying desperation of a narcissist denied what they believe is theirs. That Friday evening, I pulled into my neighborhood after a long, exhausting 10-hour shift at the warehouse. As I rounded the corner to my street, my stomach plummeted. Parked squarely in my driveway was a massive, rented moving truck, right next to Dalton and Cassidy's silver minivan. They were actually trying to move in. I slammed my truck into park behind their vehicles, blocking them in. I jumped out, my blood boiling. The back of the moving truck was open, packed with cardboard boxes and cheap furniture. Dalton and Cassidy were standing on my front lawn, directing their children to carry small items toward the house. When Cassidy saw me, she did not look scared. She threw her head back, let out a loud, theatrical sigh, and flashed that same infuriating, smug smirk. She puckered her lips in a mock pout and told me in a baby voice that everything was fine because my mommy had officially given them permission to live here, and good boys always listen to their mommies. The sheer audacity of her statement paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. I sprinted up the walkway to my front porch to check the door. What I saw made me see red. My front door lock, the heavy-duty deadbolt I had installed myself, was completely destroyed. The center cylinder had been hollowed out, leaving a jagged, metallic hole. Lying right there on the welcome mat, displaying a level of stupidity that still astounds me to this day, was a complete, cheap Harbor Freight drill bit set and a cordless drill covered in metal shavings. They had literally drilled through my front door to break in. I did not scream at them. I spun around, sprinted back to my truck, climbed into the cab, and locked the doors. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Cassidy realized what I was doing. Her smug demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by sheer panic. She ran over to my truck and started pounding her fists against the driver's side window. She screamed that I could not do this to her, that her children needed a home, and repeated that maddening phrase, "Why can't you just do this for Dalton?" I cracked the window just half an inch so the 911 dispatcher could hear everything. I yelled back that it was my house, not Dalton's. Cassidy's face twisted into pure rage, and she screamed that if I didn't hang up the phone, she was going to take her house keys and key the entire side of my truck. I calmly told the dispatcher that a woman was threatening to destroy my vehicle after breaking into my home. I looked Cassidy in the eyes and told her that if she scratched my paint, I would sue her into absolute poverty. She was just smart enough to realize I was dead serious, and she backed away, retreating toward the moving truck to hide behind Dalton. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, looking tense. Dalton, Cassidy, and their kids immediately retreated onto my front porch, trying to look like the victims of a misunderstanding. I stepped out of my truck, handed my driver's license to the officers to prove my residency, and calmly led them to the front porch. I pointed directly to the drilled-out lock, the metal shavings, and the abandoned drill sitting on the mat. I explained the entire history, the stalking, the demands, and the break-in. Right in the middle of my explanation, Victor and Brenda's car came screeching down the street. Dalton must have panic-dialed them while I was on the phone. They jumped out, running toward the cops, immediately spewing lies. Brenda cried hysterically, claiming to the officers that this was just a massive family miscommunication and that I had explicitly agreed to rent the house to Dalton. Dalton puffed his chest out, trying to look confident, and pulled a crumpled stack of printed papers from his back pocket. He handed them to the lead officer, smugly declaring that he had a legally binding lease agreement right there. The officer looked at the papers, frowned, and handed them to me. I took one look and almost burst out laughing. It was a generic lease template printed off the internet. But the best part was the signature line at the bottom. Someone had signed my name in loopy, cursive handwriting that looked absolutely nothing like my actual signature. They had never even seen my signature to try and copy it properly. I held the forged paper up and looked at Victor and Dalton. I told them, in front of the officers, that they had just handed the police physical evidence of blatant, undeniable fraud. I listed off their crimes out loud: breaking and entering, destruction of private property, and felony forgery. I told Dalton that if I pressed charges, he would be arrested, he would lose his job, his family would starve, and I would personally call Child Protective Services to take his kids away since both parents would be sitting in a jail cell. Dalton went ashen. The color completely drained from his face, and his hands started to shake. Victor looked like he was going to pass out. Brenda tried to step between me and the cops, begging me one last time to just go live in the camper and let Dalton have the house. I screamed at her that if she cared so much, she could give Dalton her house. The lead officer, clearly exhausted by the circus, told Dalton that if I pressed charges, they were all going to leave in handcuffs. The reality finally set in. Brenda surrendered. She walked over to Cassidy and whispered fiercely in her ear. Cassidy burst into dramatic, howling sobs, snatched the fake lease from my hand, and ripped it into tiny confetti pieces, throwing them onto my lawn. The second officer immediately ordered her to pick up every single piece of litter or face a citation. Dalton was forced to order his crying kids to carry their boxes back to the moving truck. Before they left, I demanded the keys to the new doorknob they had illegally installed. Dalton gritted his teeth, pulled the keys from his pocket, and instead of handing them to me, he chucked them straight down the street and into a storm drain grate. The lead officer immediately barked at him, forcing Dalton to walk down the street, pry the heavy iron grate off the drain, and dig through the muck to retrieve my keys. He came back covered in grime, slammed the keys into my hand, and got into the truck. As they drove away, Brenda yelled that I was disowned. I smiled and waved goodbye. Being disowned by toxic people is not a punishment, it is a profound blessing. For the next several months, my life was blissfully quiet. I fixed my front door, installed a heavy-duty security camera system, and went about my life. When December rolled around, I decided to host a large Christmas Eve party at my new house. I invited the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had supported me during the social media fallout. It was a wonderful night, filled with good food, expensive drinks, and loud music. About 2 hours into the party, the front door opened and Victor, Brenda, Dalton, and Cassidy walked in, carrying cheap, last-minute presents. They had not knocked. They wore these strained, terrifyingly fake smiles, acting as if the horrible events of the summer had simply never happened. Cassidy had convinced them that if they just showed up in the middle of a family gathering, I would be too embarrassed to cause a scene and throw them out. She gambled, and she lost catastrophically. I immediately walked over and shut off the music. Before I could even tell them to leave, my uncle, Brenda's own older brother, stood up from the dining table. He walked right up to Victor, his face red with anger, and told them that they were a disgrace to the family name. He yelled that after the garbage they pulled trying to steal my house, they had absolutely no right to step foot in my home. My grandparents, as old and frail as they were, stood up and backed him up, telling Brenda that they had never been more disappointed in her. Cassidy tried to do her usual crying routine, plopping down on a chair to complain about how unfair it was that I had so much space while she had 4 kids, but my uncle shut her down, telling her to get a job and stop using her uterus as a weapon. Stripped of their audience and utterly humiliated by their own parents and siblings, my family tucked their tails and fled the party. They did not try to contact me again until late February. Victor and Brenda messaged me, begging for a sit-down meeting at a public Olive Garden. I went, mostly out of morbid curiosity. Dalton was there, looking exhausted and staring at his shoes. Cassidy was noticeably absent. After we ordered drinks, Victor and Brenda practically begged me to help them. Cassidy's spending habits had driven them to the brink of financial ruin, and the cramped house was causing daily screaming matches. They needed Dalton to get his own apartment, but his credit was completely destroyed. They begged me to either give them cash for a deposit or co-sign the lease. I looked at my parents, who had allowed me to freeze in a parking lot, and laughed. I pulled out a napkin and did the rough math of my mortgage, insurance, and savings goals, proving to them that my money was heavily tied up. When Dalton finally looked up and angrily demanded that I spare the money since I did not have a family, I leaned across the table. I looked directly at Victor, mirroring the cold stare he gave me years ago on his porch, and said, "I am not an ATM, and I am not a fool. You made your bed. Now sleep in it. Winners never subsidize losers." I stood up, left a $10 bill on the table to cover my drink, and walked out, leaving them to sit in the mess they created. The pressure cooker inside my parents' house finally exploded in March, and the shrapnel destroyed everything Cassidy had built. For a long time, there had been a quiet, unspoken tension regarding Cassidy's fourth child, the baby born late the previous year. Dalton, myself, and our parents all share very dark, straight hair and similar facial structures. But as the baby grew out of the newborn phase, it became undeniably clear that the child had light, curly hair and features that did not match the family tree. Cassidy kept gaslighting Dalton, insisting the hair would darken over time, but the lie was getting impossible to maintain. Dalton finally pulled his head out of his delusions. Secretly, without telling anyone, he ordered a paternity DNA test swab for the youngest child, along with a few discreet checks on his other 3 children. He also started digging into Cassidy's phone records and bank statements while she was sleeping. He found everything. The 3 older kids were his. The youngest baby was not. Dalton confronted Cassidy in the living room, right in front of Victor and Brenda. He slammed the DNA results on the coffee table, along with printed text messages proving she had been carrying on a long-term affair with a smooth-talking guy named Felix. Cassidy was backed into a corner with absolute proof, and she completely lost her mind. She tried to deny it, then tried to blame Dalton for not giving her enough attention, but Dalton was cold and unyielding. Victor and Brenda, realizing they had sacrificed their own financial future for a cheating parasite, demanded she pack her bags and leave their house immediately. Cassidy went feral. She started screaming, throwing heavy glass decorations across the room. She lunged at Dalton, her long fake nails tearing deep gouges into his face and neck. Victor tried to intervene, and she scratched him too. In the crossfire of her violent tantrum, she actually struck her own 8-year-old son, giving the poor kid a bloody nose and a black eye when he tried to grab her leg. Brenda locked herself in the kitchen and called the police. Cassidy was arrested on the spot for domestic assault and child endangerment. Her parents had to drive over in the middle of the night to bail her out and collect her belongings. A few days after she bonded out of jail, Cassidy actually showed up at my house. I opened the door, keeping the heavy chain locked. She looked completely deranged, her eyes wide and manic. She went on a delusional, screaming rant, blaming me for her entire life falling apart. She screamed that if I had just given up my house and done my duty to support the family, her marriage would still be intact. When I tried to speak, she shoved her hand through the crack in the door, trying to claw at my face. I stepped back, pointed to the glowing red light of my new doorbell camera, and told her that everything was recording and I was dialing the police. The word camera snapped her out of her psychotic break. She turned white, ran to her car, and sped away. I filed a police report for harassment and easily secured a restraining order against her. The divorce was an absolute bloodbath, and for once, the law worked perfectly. Because she had committed adultery, assaulted her husband and child, and lived in an at-fault state, Cassidy walked away with absolutely nothing. The judge showed zero sympathy for her tears. Dalton was legally removed from the youngest child's birth certificate. Cassidy was denied alimony, saddled with 3/4 of the massive credit card debt she had accumulated, and lost primary custody of her 3 older children. Felix, the affair partner, tried to claim he wanted to be a father, but the moment the judge ordered him to pay child support, he abandoned Cassidy entirely. She was forced to move back into her parents' basement and take a minimum wage job at their small business just to survive. Dalton was a broken man. The betrayal destroyed his ego. A month after Cassidy was kicked out, he came to my house. He stood on my porch, looking exhausted, humbled, and deeply ashamed. With Cassidy gone, he wanted to give his 8-year-old son his own bedroom, but he could not afford to move out of our parents' house. Swallowing the last of his pride, he asked if he could borrow my old camper to live in, setting it up in Victor and Brenda's backyard so his kids could have the space inside. I looked at him, remembering how he had mocked me for living in that exact same camper. I could have said no. I could have told him that winners never subsidize losers. But I looked at his defeated posture and thought about my nephews and nieces who needed stability. I agreed to let him borrow it, on the strict condition that he pay for any damages. He is living out there now, running an extension cord to the house, just like I used to do. Victor and Brenda eventually came to my house alone to offer a genuine apology. With their golden illusion shattered, they were forced to confront the monstrous entitlement they had bred into their son and the horrific cruelty they had inflicted on me. They admitted they were wrong. They admitted they had failed me. I listened, nodded, and told them that while I appreciated the words, the scars do not just disappear overnight. I rent out 2 of the spare rooms in my house to close friends now. My mortgage is practically covered by their rent, my savings are growing, and my house is peaceful. I have started rebuilding a tentative relationship with my nieces and nephews, finally getting to enjoy being an uncle without their toxic mother hovering around. I survived the cold, I protected my fortress, and I finally have the peace I bled for. Am I wrong for shutting them out entirely, or should I finally accept my parents' apologies now that they've lost their golden illusion? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button and let me know your verdict in the comments below.